What if you spent 20 years believing a lie, only to find out the truth when it was far too late? This is not just a story about heartbreak. It's about trust, betrayal, and the kind of secret that can destroy a man's soul. For 2 decades, he lived his life as a father, pouring everything he had into the child he believed was his. He gave his time, his money, his love, his very being, never once doubting the bond he thought was unshakable. But then, after 20 long years, a truth surfaced. A truth so cruel, so unexpected, that it shattered everything he thought he knew about himself, his family, and the woman he once loved. He wasn't just a father fighting through the pain of divorce. He was a man who had built his world on a foundation of lies. Can you imagine that? Working 2 jobs to pay for school fees, showing up at birthdays with the biggest smile, sitting in the front row at every performance, every graduation, watching a child grow, cheering for them, crying with pride, all while never suspecting the truth that lingered in the shadows. And here's the question. What would you do if you discovered that the child you had raised, the one you've sacrificed your youth and your happiness for, wasn't yours at all? Would you collapse? Would you lash out? Or would you rise from the ashes and fight back? Because this man, let's call him Daniel, he did all 3. He fell apart. He raged against the betrayal. And then he made a choice. He decided to uncover everything, to drag the past into the light, to show the world that even after 20 years of silence, truth cannot stay buried forever. But before we get there, let's talk about who Daniel really was. He wasn't rich. He wasn't powerful. He was just a man who tried his best, a man who loved deeply, who carried himself with dignity even after his marriage fell apart. The divorce was messy: anger, blame, disappointment. Yet through all of it, he held on to one thing: his role as a father. No matter how bitter the arguments became, no matter how far his ex-wife pushed him away, he always told himself, "At least I still have her. At least I still have my daughter." That thought kept him going. That bond gave him purpose. He never questioned it. Why would he? She looked up to him. She called him Dad. She ran to him for advice, for comfort, for love. To Daniel, that was enough. But hidden beneath those years of devotion was a secret that would one day break him. It's almost poetic, isn't it? The way life can wait quietly before cutting you open with the truth. He thought the storm was over when the divorce ended. He thought the worst pain of his life was behind him. But the real storm, the one that would tear his world apart, had been waiting all along. And when it finally struck, it didn't just wound him. It made him question everything. Did his ex-wife ever love him? Were all those years of fatherhood wasted? Did his daughter know? And most of all, how could he ever trust again? These questions ate at him night after night until he decided he couldn't live with the shadows anymore. He needed the truth. No matter how painful, no matter how destructive, he needed to know. And what he discovered would leave him speechless. Because after 20 years of loyalty, after decades of sacrifice and devotion, the reality came crashing down. His daughter, the one he had fought so hard to keep in his life, wasn't his. Not by blood, not by biology. The betrayal was complete. His ex-wife had hidden it for decades. She let him pay, she let him suffer, she let him sacrifice, all while knowing the truth. And yet this isn't just a story of betrayal. This is a story of revenge, of justice, of a man reclaiming his dignity after it was stolen from him. Because when Daniel faced the truth, he didn't just crumble. He fought back. This is where the story begins. With a man broken, betrayed, and desperate for answers. With a man who gave everything, only to realize it was all a lie. And as you'll see, the path he chose would not only expose the truth, but also bring a reckoning no one saw coming. The truth was about to destroy everything he thought he knew. Divorce. That single word can tear families apart, leaving behind wounds that never seem to heal. For Daniel, 20 years ago, it was more than just a legal document. It was the ending of a love story he thought would last forever. The beginning of a life he'd never imagined he'd be forced to live. The marriage had been rocky for years. Arguments filled the air like smoke in a burning house. Some were over money, others over trust. And sometimes over nothing at all, small things that somehow turned into battles that left both of them exhausted. Daniel tried to hold the pieces together. He worked long hours, believing that if he provided enough, his wife would feel secure and their love would survive. But trust once broken is hard to fix. His wife had grown distant, secretive. She stopped looking at him the way she used to. Where there was once laughter, there was now silence. Where there had been warmth, there was coldness. Eventually, the fights became unbearable. She wanted freedom. He wanted peace. And so, after years of pretending things were fine, they stood in a courtroom and signed their names to the end of their marriage. It was painful, devastating, but Daniel clung to one thing. The one bright light that kept him steady, their daughter. She was still young when the divorce happened, too young to understand why her parents couldn't stay together. All she knew was that her family had broken apart, and Daniel made himself a promise that day, a vow that would define the next 2 decades of his life. Even though the marriage ended, she will never feel abandoned, not by me. And he kept that promise. The years after the divorce weren't easy. Daniel wasn't a rich man. He had bills piling up, debts that wouldn't disappear, and a household that now felt empty. But every paycheck he earned, every hour he worked, he set aside what was needed for his daughter. Child support was never late. School supplies were always covered. Clothes, food, the things she needed to grow, he provided them all. To do that, he worked harder than ever. Some weeks he took on extra shifts, even overnight jobs. There were times he barely slept, dragging himself from one job to the next, running on coffee and sheer determination. His body ached, his mind was weary, but every time he saw his daughter smile, it felt worth it. There were moments when he questioned if he could keep going. Nights when exhaustion nearly broke him. But then he would remind himself, she didn't ask for this divorce. She didn't ask for a broken home. I won't let her suffer for mistakes that weren't hers. And so, despite the chaos, he built a bond with her. A bond he believed nothing could destroy. He never missed her school plays. No matter how tired he was, he'd sit in the audience, clapping the loudest, his eyes shining with pride as she took the stage. He was there at birthdays, showing up with homemade cakes or carefully wrapped presents. Not expensive, but chosen with love. When she struggled with homework, he sat beside her at the kitchen table, patiently explaining, cheering her on when she finally got the answers right. There were quiet talks. To those tender father-daughter conversations that happen late at night. When the world is quiet and the only sound is their voices, she'd sit on the couch, curled up in a blanket, and share her little secrets, her fears, her dreams. And Daniel would listen. Really listen. He never wanted her to feel like she had to face the world alone. To him, these weren't just moments. They were proof. Proof that even though the marriage had crumbled, his role as a father remained unshaken. But while Daniel poured himself into fatherhood, his ex-wife seemed to go in the opposite direction. She carried bitterness like a second skin. Every interaction with her felt heavy, tense. She criticized him often, accused him of not doing enough, even when he was giving everything he had. Sometimes she used their daughter as a pawn in her anger, trying to keep Daniel at arm's length, and yet he never let it stop him. He swallowed his pride, endured her sharp words, because the only thing that mattered was his daughter. He would not let bitterness steal her away from him. Still looking back, he remembered small things that seemed odd. Times when his ex-wife looked at him with a strange expression, as though she carried a secret she couldn't say out loud. There were moments she'd grow tense if anyone asked too many questions about the past. But at the time, Daniel didn't dig deeper. He was too focused on surviving the present. Too focused on giving his daughter the best he could. As the years rolled on, Daniel watched her grow. From a little girl with pigtails to a teenager with ambitions, to a young woman finding her place in the world. Every milestone brought him pride. Every struggle made him want to shield her. He wasn't perfect, but he was constant. He was there, and through it all, he believed one thing without question. She was his daughter. Not just in heart, but in blood. That bond was sacred, unshakable. Or so he thought, because what Daniel didn't know, what he could never have imagined, was that all those sacrifices, all those years of devotion, were built on a lie. lie buried so deep it took 2 decades to come to the surface, a secret his ex-wife thought she could carry forever. But time has a way of dragging secrets into the light, and Daniel was about to discover the truth, a truth that would make him question everything. His past, his sacrifices, even his very identity as a father. But beneath these years of sacrifice, a hidden truth was waiting, one he never imagined. For 20 years, Daniel lived with certainty. Certainty that no matter what else had gone wrong in his life, one thing was unshakable: his bond with his daughter. She was his anchor, the proof that something good had come out of a broken marriage. But sometimes, life has a cruel way of planting questions where we least expect them. It started with something small. His daughter, now grown, now building a life of her own, needed some medical records. She was filling out forms, the kind that asked for family history, heart disease, diabetes, allergies, genetic conditions. The routine kind of paperwork most people barely think about. She called her father. "Dad, do we have a history of this? What about that? Did Grandpa ever deal with these issues?" Daniel answered as best he could. Heart disease on his side of the family? Yes, diabetes. No, allergies. Just seasonal. He explained the things he remembered, even pulled out an old folder where he had kept some of his parents' medical notes. She thanked him, wrote it down, and hung up the phone. But a week later, she called again. This time her voice was different, hesitant, uneasy. "Dad, the doctor said some of my results don't match up with what you told me." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean they don't match up?" She explained. The genetic markers in her test didn't line up with the conditions in Daniel's family. In fact, they suggested she carried traits that had no connection to his side at all. At first, Daniel laughed it off. "Oh, you know, doctors, tests aren't perfect. They make mistakes." He brushed it aside, convincing himself it was nothing. Paperwork mix-up. Maybe the lab messed up. It happens all the time, right? But deep down, a small crack appeared. Asterisk. A few weeks passed. Daniel tried to ignore the nagging thought. He reminded himself of all the memories, all the moments, all the years. Surely one test couldn't shake 20 years of fatherhood, but the questions didn't stop. His daughter pressed him again. "Dad, are you sure about our family history? Because the doctors said I might need more information, especially if it runs on your side." Daniel grew quiet. He repeated the same answers, but doubt crept into his voice. And in that silence, something heavy settled in. He found himself lying awake at night, replaying her words. "Doesn't match up. Doesn't line up. What did that mean?" And then came the flashbacks. Memories he hadn't thought about in years began to surface. His ex-wife's strange behavior during their marriage, the late nights when she said she was working late, but couldn't explain why her hair smelled like someone else's cologne, the times she came home distracted, avoiding his eyes, the whispered phone calls in the kitchen that always ended the moment he walked in. Back then, Daniel told himself he was imagining things. He didn't want to believe his marriage was worse than it already was. He thought she was just stressed, just tired, just angry. But now those memories returned with sharper edges. Had she been hiding something even back then? Daniel tried to shake it off. He told himself, "No. Stop thinking like that. Don't go down that road." But the doubts grew louder. At a family gathering, he noticed something else. People often said his daughter didn't resemble him much. Over the years, he laughed it off. "She looks more like her mother," he'd say with a smile. But now those comments echoed differently. The shape of her jaw, the color of her eyes, the little habits that seemed foreign to his side of the family. He wanted to dismiss it. He tried to. But once doubt takes root, it's hard to silence. One evening, his daughter asked him again, "Dad, the doctor suggested a genetic panel. Just to be safe. Maybe we can both take one, compare results." Daniel hesitated. His heart thudded in his chest. He smiled, nodded, agreed. What else could he do? But inside, he was terrified, because for the first time, he asked himself a question he had never dared before. What if? "She isn't mine." He hated himself for even thinking it. After all, she was his daughter. He raised her. He loved her. That should have been enough. But logic couldn't quiet the pounding in his chest. The night before the test, Daniel sat alone in his living room. Old memories washed over him. He remembered her as a little girl running into his arms, calling him daddy. He remembered the way she cried when he dropped her off at school, the way she clung to his leg, begging him not to leave. He remembered the pride in her eyes when he cheered from the sidelines at her soccer games. How could a test take all of that away? He shook his head, whispered to himself, no matter what happens, she's still my daughter. Nothing changes that. But even as he said it, his hands trembled. The test itself was simple. A cheek swab, a few minutes of paperwork. He tried to act calm, cracking a few jokes to ease the tension. She smiled, but he could tell she was nervous too. Days turned into weeks. Daniel told himself he wasn't worried. He told himself the results would clear everything up. He told himself it was just another formality. But at night, lying in bed, his mind betrayed him. He thought about his ex-wife, about the bitterness in her eyes during the divorce, about the way she had demanded money, insisted on child support, fought him on every detail, and then he remembered something else. A rumor whispered years ago about a man she had been seen with during their marriage. A co-worker, someone she spent too much time with. Daniel had ignored it back then, too tired to start another fight, but now it felt like a puzzle piece snapping into place. The day the results arrived, Daniel almost couldn't open the envelope. His hands shook as he tore it open, his heart pounding in his ears. For a moment, the words blurred before his eyes. He blinked, forced himself to read again, and then silence, his worst fear, his deepest suspicion, confirmed. The test didn't lie. He was not her biological father. The air left his lungs. The room spun. 20 years of memories crashed against him like a tidal wave. Every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every birthday, every graduation, every tear he had wiped away, all of it, suddenly twisted by a single truth. And in that moment, Daniel realized his life would never be the same, because the truth he had feared most had finally arrived. The paper shook in Daniel's hands. The words blurred, but he didn't need to read them twice. The truth was staring him in the face, cold, unforgiving. He was not the father, not biologically, not in the eyes of science. In that moment, 20 years of memories collapsed like a house built on sand. The birthdays he had saved up for, the sleepless nights he had worked through, the quiet moments when she had called him dad with love in her voice, all of it, built on a lie. Daniel's chest tightened, his breath caught. He had always believed the divorce was the worst thing to happen to him. He was wrong. This revelation was worse than every fight, every insult, every lonely night put together. He dropped into a chair, the envelope sliding from his hands onto the floor. He buried his face in his palms. And then it hit him. Not just sadness, not just anger, but something deeper. A hollow ache that spread through his body, pulling him apart from the inside out. Heartbreak, rage, betrayal, all. At once, his mind replayed the last 20 years like a cruel film reel. The time he worked double shifts, just so he could afford her school trip. The Christmas he went without a coat so she could have the one she wanted. The nights he came home with blistered hands, only to stay awake helping her with homework. The time he stood in the rain cheering her soccer game, drenched but smiling because she looked for him in the crowd. Every sacrifice, every ounce of love he poured into her life, it all came crashing down under the weight of one truth. She wasn't his. His ex-wife had stolen more than his marriage. She had stolen his very identity as a father. Daniel leaned back, staring at the ceiling. As the memories of their divorce came flooding back, he remembered how cruel she had been. How she demanded more money, accused him of being a failure, of not being enough. He remembered how she twisted words in court, painting herself as the victim, while he carried the weight of blame, and through it all he had never fought her when it came to child support. Never argued, never hesitated, because in his heart he thought, this is my daughter, I'll give whatever it takes. But now, looking back, he saw the manipulation for what it was. She had known. She must have known she had let him break his body to pay bills that weren't his responsibility. She had let him cry with guilt, thinking he had failed his family. She had watched him sacrifice year after year, all while holding the truth in her pocket like a weapon she never intended to reveal. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. His jaw tightened. 20 years of love. 20 years of sacrifice. All built on a lie. He whispered the words, each one heavier than the last. 20 years. Stolen from me. And yet beneath his anger, there was something else. Fear. A fear that nearly broke him more than the betrayal itself. How would his daughter take it? Because if this truth shattered him, what would it do to her? She had grown up believing Daniel was her father. He had been there for every scraped knee, every school project, every heartbreak. He was her constant, her protector, her dad. How could she process the fact that the man who raised her wasn't tied to her by blood? When she found out, her world cracked just like his. Confusion filled her eyes. She questioned everything. What does this mean? Who am I really? Who's my real father? Her voice trembled, her hands shook. She looked at Daniel for answers he didn't have, and that broke him even more. He wasn't angry at her, never at her. But watching the pain wash over her face was unbearable. She was just as much a victim of this lie as he was. Daniel knew then. The real betrayal wasn't only against him. It was against both of them. His ex-wife hadn't just lied to a man. She had lied to her own daughter, denying her the truth of who she was for 20 long years, and that cruelty was unforgivable. For days, Daniel spiraled. He walked through his house in silence, haunted by memories. Every photograph on the wall mocked him. Every framed picture of birthdays, graduations, holidays, they all seemed to whisper, "This was never yours." At night, he couldn't sleep. He would sit by the window, staring into the dark, his heart pounding with rage. How could she do this to him? To their daughter? The woman he once loved had destroyed everything. She hadn't just betrayed him as a husband. She had betrayed him as a father. But slowly, the tears dried. Slowly, the shock hardened into something else. Determination. Daniel realized he had two choices: collapse under the weight of the truth, or rise and take back the power she had stolen from him. He wiped his face, clenched his fists, and whispered to himself, "She thinks she's won. She thinks she buried the truth forever. But I'm not done. Not yet, because beneath all that heartbreak, one fire still burned. A fire that had been lit by 20 years of lies. He wasn't going to let her win anymore. Daniel had every reason to break, every reason to surrender to the weight of betrayal. But something inside him refused to collapse, because while heartbreak had torn him apart, anger was piecing him back together. He wasn't going to be her victim anymore. Not after 20 years of lies. Not after everything she had stolen. Instead, he was going to turn his pain into power. It started with a single thought that kept repeating in his mind. She knew. She always knew that truth gnawed at him. His ex-wife hadn't just made a mistake. She had lived in deception. For 2 decades, she let him bleed his time, his money, his love into raising a child under false pretenses. Daniel realized he couldn't move on until he knew the full story, until he knew who had been in the shadows all along. So he decided if she buried the truth, then he would dig it up. The first step was memory. He sat at his kitchen table, staring at the wall, forcing himself to relive the past. The arguments, the absences, the odd moments he had brushed aside. He remembered a man's name that once came up, someone from her office. A colleague she claimed was just a friend, a name she used to drop casually, almost too casually. As if rehearsed, that name became Daniel's first lead. He started asking questions. Quietly, carefully. Old friends. Former neighbors. People who had witnessed the marriage from the outside. At first, no one wanted to get involved. Too much time had passed. Too many wounds were old. But when Daniel pressed, when they saw the hurt in his eyes, the truth began to leak out. Yes, people remembered. They remembered the late nights she spent away from home. They remembered the whispers, the rumors. They remembered seeing her car parked outside another man's house. Each recollection stung like a fresh cut, but each one also strengthened Daniel's resolve. The picture was getting clearer. Next came the boxes. Daniel had kept them 4 years old. Photo albums. Scraps of paper. Forgotten mail. He opened them now with new eyes. flipping through pictures he hadn't looked at in decades, and then he saw it, an old photograph from a work party. His ex-wife smiling too brightly, standing too close to that man from her office, their hands almost touching. The way her body leaned toward him, betraying comfort, familiarity. Daniel's stomach turned. It wasn't proof, but it was enough. Enough to remind him that the affair hadn't been a passing suspicion. It had been real, every piece of information. Daniel found became fuel. A neighbor remembering strange visits. A co-worker confirming they were seen together often. Old notes in her handwriting hinted at secret meetings. Piece by piece, the puzzle formed. And with every discovery, Daniel felt the weight shift. For years, she had held power over him. She had written the narrative, cast him as the absent husband, the struggling father. But now, Daniel was writing his own version. A version built not on lies, but on truth. This wasn't about going to court. He wasn't preparing for lawyers or judges. He was preparing for something far more powerful. Exposure, because what his ex-wife had counted on, what she had always counted on, was silence. That no one would ever dig too deep, that the past would stay buried. But Daniel was done being silent as the weeks passed. His plan took shape. Step by step, he gathered facts. Old photos. Statements from people who had seen what he hadn't, records that contradicted her claims at night. He lined them up across his table like a detective building a case. Each clue, each fragment became a weapon. Not for violence, but for truth. And the more he collected, the calmer he felt. Not the calm of peace, the calm of purpose. For the first time since the DNA results, he felt in control. The suspense built inside him like a storm waiting to break. He would pace his living room, replaying the confrontation in his mind. What he would say, how he would say it. He imagined the look on her face when she realized her empire of lies was crumbling. Some nights he couldn't sleep. His heart would race as if the confrontation was already happening, as if she was already sitting across from him, caught, exposed. He would whisper into the dark, "You thought you won, but you don't win anymore." But beneath all the anger and preparation, Daniel also thought of his daughter. She was the reason he had endured all those years, the reason he had never given up. And now she was the reason he couldn't let this betrayal go unanswered. Because she deserved the truth too. She deserved to know who her mother really was, what she had done, how far the lies stretched. Daniel wasn't doing this just for himself. He was doing it for her. One evening, Daniel spread the evidence across his table once more. Photos, testimonies, timelines. He stood there for a long time, staring at it all, and then he whispered the words that had become his mantra. She thought the past was buried, but now I'm ready to dig it up. The plan was set. The confrontation was coming, and this time Daniel wouldn't be the man left broken. He would be the man who uncovered everything. The day finally came. Daniel had imagined this moment 1,000 times. He had played it in his head during sleepless nights, rehearsed the words in his living room, whispered his lines into the silence until they became second nature. But no amount of preparation could fully brace him for the storm about to break. It began with a simple call. He told her they needed to meet. His voice was steady, but beneath the calm there was steel. At first she resisted. She tried to brush him off, claiming she was busy, that there was nothing left to talk about after all these years. But Daniel didn't waver. "We're going to talk, whether you like it or not." Reluctantly, she agreed. They chose a quiet cafe, neutral ground. A place where emotions could be contained, or at least where she thought they could. When Daniel walked in, his ex-wife was already there, sitting at a corner table. She looked older, of course. Time had carved its marks into her face. But her eyes, sharp, calculating, were the same ones he remembered. For a brief moment, memories of their marriage flashed in his mind. Their early days when he believed her smile was real. The nights when he thought they were building a future together, but those memories burned away quickly, replaced by 20 years of lies. He sat across from her. The air between them was heavy, charged at first. He said nothing. He simply looked at her, calm, steady. The silence itself was louder than any accusation. Finally, he spoke. "You lied to me? For 20 years." His voice was low. "Yeah, but every word cut like a blade. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her eyes darting away. "Daniel, I don't know what you're talking about," he cut her off, his hand sliding an envelope across the table. "The DNA results. Don't play games with me." You always knew she wasn't mine." Her mask cracked. She tried to laugh it off at first, shaking her head. "Oh, come on! Those tests, they're not always accurate. You're blowing things out of proportion." But Daniel didn't flinch. "I gave you everything," he said, his voice rising. "I worked my hands raw. I went without so she would never feel without. I stayed up nights. I broke myself in half for her. And the whole time you knew the truth." She opened her mouth again, fumbling for excuses. "Daniel, listen. Things were complicated back then. You don't understand. I was scared. I didn't know what to do." But Daniel slammed another piece of evidence on the table. The photo, testimony, the timeline. "You weren't scared. You were selfish. You let me bleed for a lie. You let me be mocked, pitied, broken, all while you smiled and cashed the checks." And then the moment Daniel hadn't expected, a voice behind him, "Dad." He froze. Slowly he turned. His daughter. She had followed him. She had overheard everything. Her eyes were wide, her face pale. Tears clung to her lashes as she looked from him to her mother. "Is it true?" she whispered. Her voice cracked, fragile, like glass ready to shatter. The cafe went silent. Conversations around them faded into nothing. His ex-wife stammered, reaching out a hand. "Sweetheart, don't." But the daughter pulled back, her voice trembling now with anger. "Tell me the truth. Who's my father?" Her words split the air like thunder. People turned to look. But inside that corner, the world felt like it had stopped. Daniel's heart broke all over again, watching her crumble. He wanted to hold her, protect her, shield her from this ugly truth. But she deserved honesty, and his ex-wife had no more places to hide. The daughter pressed harder, her voice rising. "All these years, all those times you told me Dad was my rock, that he was the one I could always count on. And now you're telling me it was a lie?" Tears streamed down her face. The ex-wife's lips trembled. She tried to form words, but nothing came out. The mask she had worn for 20 years was gone. All that remained was silence. Daniel looked at her, the woman who had destroyed so much. For years she had controlled the narrative. She had painted herself as the victim, manipulated the truth, twisted the story, but now she was exposed. Stripped bare in front of the very people she had deceived. Daniel leaned forward, his voice quiet but sharp as glass. "You built your life on lies. And now they've all come crashing down." The daughter sobbed, her head in her hands. Daniel reached out, resting a hand gently on her shoulder. "I may not be your father by blood," he whispered, his voice breaking, "but I will always be your father by love. Nothing changes that." His daughter clung to him, her tears soaking his shirt. For her, the world had just shattered. But in that moment, she knew one thing for certain. The man who had raised her was the only true father she had ever known. Across the table, his ex-wife sat frozen, speechless, exposed. Nowhere to run. Daniel stood. He didn't shout. He didn't curse. He didn't need to. His calm was louder than any outburst. For 20 years she had stolen his peace. But today he reclaimed it. He turned his daughter by his side and walked out of that cafe, not as a victim. Not as a man broken, but as a man who finally knew the truth. And behind him at that little corner table, his ex-wife was left in silence, her empire of lies crumbling around her. The storm had passed, the shouting, the tears, the silence that hung heavy inside that cafe. It was all behind them now. But when Daniel walked away with his daughter at his side, something inside him shifted. For the first time in 20 years, the weight he had been carrying, the false guilt, the invisible chains of deception began to fall away. He had faced the truth. And though it tore him apart, it also set him free. The days that followed were quiet but heavy. His daughter struggled most of all. She'd been blindsided, her sense of identity shattered in an instant. The questions haunted her. Who am I really? Where do I come from? Why did she lie to me? There were nights when she barely spoke. times when she sat across from Daniel staring at her plate, lost in thought. And each time Daniel's heart broke all over again, but he stayed. Just as he always had, he didn't push her. He didn't demand she be okay. Instead, he gave her the same thing he had given her all her life: presence, steady, reliable, a father. In every way that mattered, and slowly she began to see it. One evening, she finally spoke. "Dad," she whispered, her voice trembling, "I don't know how to process all of this. But I know one thing. You're the only father I've ever had, and nothing will ever change that." Her words cut through the haze of betrayal like sunlight breaking through clouds. Daniel swallowed hard, fighting the tears. He reached for her hand and whispered back, "That's all I needed to hear." In that moment, the bond they thought had been broken began to rebuild, not on lies, but on truth. Meanwhile, his ex-wife faced her own aftermath. The confrontation had stripped her mask away. Her daughter's anger, Daniel's evidence, undeniable DNA results, it all left her with nowhere to hide. The whispers spread quickly among those who knew them. Friends, family, old neighbors, the truth leaked out piece by piece. And with each passing day, her carefully constructed image crumbled. She was left in silence. No defense, no power. Just shame. Daniel didn't need to see it to know. He didn't care anymore. For the first time, her manipulation no longer reached him. What mattered was that he was free for 20 years. He had carried a weight that wasn't his. He had thought he was failing, thought he wasn't good enough, thought he had been the reason for the collapse of their marriage, but now the truth had rewritten everything. He wasn't the failure. He wasn't the weak one. He was the man who stood tall through lies, who gave love even when it wasn't returned. He raised a daughter on nothing but grit and heart. The guilt was gone. The obligation was gone. All that remained was clarity. He found himself walking lighter, breathing deeper. It wasn't that the pain disappeared overnight. It didn't. The betrayal still stung. The memories still carried scars. But now the pain had meaning. It wasn't wasted, because through it he had discovered who he truly was, not a victim, not a broken man, but a father who refused to abandon love. Even when love had abandoned him, life slowly took a new rhythm. He and his daughter rebuilt their bond one step at a time. Long talks over coffee, walks in the park where silence was enough. Even laughter returned, cautious at first, then stronger, as though healing was weaving its way through every conversation. And though the truth had shaken them, it also gave them something unexpected: honesty. For the first time, their relationship was built on nothing but truth. And in that honesty, there was strength. Daniel knew justice had been served. Not in a courtroom, not with papers or judges, but in the way lies had been exposed, in the way his ex-wife had been left powerless, and in the way his daughter chose love and honesty over deceit. It was bittersweet, painful, yes, but also liberating, because in the end, he realized something powerful. He hadn't just uncovered a betrayal. He hadn't just exposed a lie. He had reclaimed his life one evening, sitting with his daughter. He reflected aloud. For 20 years, I thought I was trapped. I thought my story was over. But now I see it. The truth didn't break me. It freed me. His daughter smiled faintly, tears in her eyes. "You found something even greater than revenge, Dad." He nodded, his voice steady. "I found freedom." And with that, Daniel walked forward into the rest of his life, not as a man chained by the past, but as one who had broken free. Justice had been served. The lies had been destroyed. And what remained was stronger than revenge, stronger than anger. What remained was the truth. What do we take away from Daniel's story? On the surface, it's about betrayal, a lie that stretched across 2 decades, a truth buried so deep it nearly stayed hidden forever. But underneath, it's about something much more powerful. It's about strength. It's about survival. It's about the freedom that comes when truth finally breaks the chains of deception. For 20 years, Daniel lived inside someone else's lie. He sacrificed. He struggled. He carried burdens that were never his to carry. And yet, through it all, he remained the one thing his daughter could count on: a father. That's the lesson. Blood may connect people, but it doesn't define love. Actions do. Commitment does. Presence does. Daniel proved that fatherhood isn't written in DNA, it's written in sacrifice. In love, in showing up day after day, even when it hurts. But the story also reminds us of something darker. Lies can last years. Lies can shape lives. Lies can twist the truth so tightly that even the people living inside them believe them to be unshakable. And yet, no matter how long the shadow of betrayal stretches, truth has a way of rising. It may take 20 years. It may come when you least expect it. But it always comes. And when it does, it burns everything false to the ground. Daniel's ex-wife thought she had buried the past. She thought her secrets were safe. But when the truth finally surfaced, all her power vanished in an instant. That's what deception does. It promises control, but in the end, it always collapses under its own weight. Her empire of lies crumbled. And Daniel, he walked away not as her victim, but as her proof. Proof that no lie can silence the truth forever. To the audience, the message is clear. Value honesty. Hold it close. Guard it with everything you have. Because once trust is broken, it cannot be rebuilt the same way. And if you've been betrayed, remember Daniel's lesson. Sometimes the greatest revenge is not anger, not shouting, not even payback sometimes. The greatest revenge is walking away stronger. Yes, Daniel lost 20 years. 20 years of sacrifice, 20 years of believing a story that wasn't real, but he gained something priceless in return. He gained freedom. He gained clarity. He gained the peace that only truth can bring, and most of all, he gained the knowledge that he was never weak. He was strong enough to endure betrayal, and stronger still to rise from it. So if you take one thing from his story, let it be this: do not let deception define your life. Do not let betrayal be the final chapter of your story. Because when the truth comes, and it always does, you have a choice. Collapse under the weight of it, or rise stronger because of it. Daniel chose to rise, and in the end that was the real victory. Not revenge, not payback, but freedom. Because sometimes the most powerful ending to a story of betrayal is not destruction, it's walking away stronger, wiser, and unshackled by lies.